So this is the idea that something, when it's surprising or new or interesting, engages our attention and captures our attention. So there's very good research on what characteristics make us strive for new knowledge, what helps to engage us or bring us into a new idea. And so there are 5 characteristics that have been identified, and this was building on for the last 50 years of research on both cognition, economics, and behavior. And the 5 characteristics have to be something, always have to involve surprise. It has to involve something incongruous, which means there has to be a contradiction between what you knew and what you thought you knew. It has to be very important to you, something personally relevant, something salient, as well as something that provides an epiphany. And all of these things tend to have something in common with a very great story or a narrative. So stories, the power of stories for cognition, they both help to engage us, to bring us into new information. So for example, a child who may not be very interested in physics or mathematics, a lot of times if you put out balls in front of them or you help to show them a moving object in water, will suddenly become interested in a physics problem. Stories also help us to remember and to organize our thoughts. So can anyone here tell me what is familiar with memory techniques? This is sometimes more common in India than the past.
Mind map.
Yes, a mind map. Thank you. If you're not familiar with mind maps, so a mind map or a memory palace is recalling items or ideas by assigning them a space in your mind. And so it can either be a physical house or a structure where each place or each item is a room or a piece of furniture. And then the idea is that it makes it easier to recall pieces. So we wanted the first part of which, and part of this is intuitive, and we've heard this before, is that why do you engage, for example, children? Why do we tell children stories to help bring them into new information? And why is it that when you're trying to teach children about math, you don't start with the numbers? You start with showing them 2 balls and you show them how it starts with 4. But the second part of storytelling, and maybe what a lot of you showed up for today, was how do we use stories as weapons? How do we use them in our own work to try to convince people or to persuade them and use them as a form of rhetoric? And this, I would also, is extremely important, especially for the type of work that we do. And it's very important that researchers and practitioners and people that we call experts learn to engage with normal people or practical folks in non-specialized language. And this is because a lot of our ideas, whether it's scientific evidence or whether it's finance language, has to compete with a lot of non-scientific stories. And a lot of these stories can be very compelling. So the idea that poor people aren't very smart, and this is the way that things are. And these are the traditional stories that you always hear, and a lot of them are very detailed, and they're folk tales and they're myths. And it's very hard to fight these types of stories with finance models. And anyone who's here who's ever tried to explain what you do at work, what do you do all day long, and has answered the question with, as some people do, I work in Taramani, which is not an answer to what do you do all day, is because we're often very bad at telling a compelling story about what we do, or how it is that what we do is practical to someone who isn't in our field. But this is a non-trivial thing. Being able to communicate our ideas is very non-trivial, because often our ideas are in competition with bad ideas that are more sexy and more compelling. So here's an idea. So this is an idea that was not a trivial thing. That was not a trivial thing at all. But there was someone who thought that regular folks and regular people, maybe he thought that they would be able to understand him. He somehow had faith enough that normal people or regular folks would be able to understand him. So the ideas that we have in finance are not a new problem. The ideas we have in development are not a new problem. So I'll tell you a story. So in the 17th century, Galileo, he had this problem. But he had enough faith that maybe 17th century Italians would be able to understand him. And unlike most of us, he had a really great gift for storytelling. So Galileo, instead of writing his formulas like this, or putting them in Latin like Isaac Newton did, he made a beautiful book with gorgeous illustrations, and he wrote it in Latin, and he published it for a popular press. And his book, The Dialogues, which is a great story, was written about a debate between two guys and talking about how the Earth moved around the sun. And this here isn't what got Galileo put under house arrest. This isn't what made him dangerous or made his ideas revolutionary. It was this. It was the idea that his ability to communicate his narrative to people and to make his ideas compelling to people. And this also isn't dumbing down his math. It's not making it stupid, and it's not lying to anyone. And that's also important, is that Galileo wasn't cheating, and he wasn't, which is a lot of times what the critique will be of people who say, that's just a story or that's just an anecdote. He struggled very hard to make sure that he both honored the math and honored the truth of his idea, as well as made it compelling so that people could understand. And so here are two quotes that we like very much. And can anyone tell me who E.O. Wilson is? It's okay, I only know because I read some articles for this. An evolutionary biologist, he studies bees. So convergence and hive theory, he studies bees. But he's also one of the great storytellers who's very involved in trying to make complicated ideas about hives and hive theory accessible to people. And so he's a big supporter, obviously, of narrative and how we all live by narrative. And the author of Behind the Beautiful Forevers says it's very important to know the big data, which is the only thing that people will respect. Is governments and government statisticians will always say, I want to see what does the NSSO data say or what does the latest census data say, but that's not enough to move them. You need that personal story, and you have to link that data to an emotion. So here's, to bring it home, so maybe the Galileo 17th century was a little too far back to tell you a story. So here's another story that we've a lot of times have been talking about lately, which is what is the evidence on why people don't open bank accounts, or why do we see such low savings participation?
So we've highlighted, so first let's talk about the sources of this data. So the data here comes from three main sources. So first, of course, is from the Global Index that we're already familiar with. Two of those tables come from Amy's paper documenting transaction costs. And the third paper comes from a more recent paper that documents the interaction between customers who walk in the bank and bank clients. So I'm just going to take a minute. Let's just process a lot of data on this. So just give me a minute to think about it. So I'd like you guys to pay some attention to what we've highlighted on this slide. So we're talking about, so all of this is self-reported data, right? So these are people responding to surveys repeatedly in several rounds and talking about how they feel they don't have enough documents, or they don't have enough time, or they don't have enough money to open. So let's just think about why someone may, what is the data telling you? சொல்லுங்க சார். தாராளமா பண்ணலாம். ரெண்டு போட்டோ கொண்டு வரணும். ஓகே, இன்ட்ரடியூஸ் எல்லாம் பண்ணிடணும். அப்புறம் அட்ரஸ் ப்ரூஃப் ஐடி ப்ரூஃப்லாம் வேணும். அட்ரஸ் ப்ரூஃப்னா பேன் கார்டு, பாஸ்போர்ட், ரேஷன் கார்டு, ஓட்டர் ஐடி, பில், கேஷ் பில், அதெல்லாம் கொண்டு வாங்க. ஐடி எடுத்தாங்க. ஐடி ப்ரூஃப்னா அதே போட்டோ வச்சுட்டு வேணும். ஆனால் அதே தான் பேன், பாஸ்போர்ட், ஓட்டர் ஐடி அதெல்லாம் இருக்குன்னா உங்ககிட்ட கொண்டு வாங்க. பேன் ரொம்ப இம்பார்ட்டன்ட் டாக்குமெண்ட்ஸ். ஏன் பேன் வச்சுக்கலாம் நீங்க? இந்த அக்கௌண்ட் சரி சரி என்ன எப்போ கொண்டு வாங்க? சரி, ஃபார்ம் இருக்கு கொடுக்குறேன். இருங்க ஒரு நிமிஷம். So நீங்க டெபாசிட் டெபாசிட்டே இல்லாம கட்டணும்னா அது நான் சொல்றேன் இந்த கார்ப்பரேட் salary account அப்படின்னு ஒன்று இருக்கு. சரியா? உங்க கம்பெனி வந்து இந்த பேங்க்ல அக்கவுண்ட் வச்சிருக்காங்கன்னா அவங்க உங்களுக்கு salary account கிரியேட் பண்ணி கொடுப்பாங்க. அதுல மாசம் மாசம் உங்க salary ஆட்டோமேட்டிக்கா கிரெடிட் ஆயிடும். அதுல பேலன்ஸ் எல்லாம் ஒண்ணும் கிடையாது. நீங்க உங்க சேவிங்ஸ் யூஸ் பண்ணிக்கோங்க. உங்க ஆபீஸ்ல விசாரிச்சு பாருங்க எங்க அக்கவுண்ட் வச்சிருக்காங்க. இதுதான் சார் அந்த பேசிக் அக்கவுண்ட். அதான் அந்த ஃபார்ம் போட்டு பாருங்க ரெகுலர் அக்கவுண்ட் அப்படின்னு. இதுதான். இது தவிர பாத்தீங்கன்னா கோல்ட் அக்கவுண்ட் இருக்கு. அதுக்கு 50,000 பேலன்ஸ் இருக்கணும். 2 lakh பேலன்ஸ் வச்சீங்கன்னா பிளாட்டினம் அக்கவுண்ட் இருக்கு. அதுக்கெல்லாம் டோர் ஸ்டெப் சர்வீஸ் கிடைக்கும். பட் நம்ம மாதிரி ஆளுங்களுக்கு இதான் இந்த 10,000 பேலன்ஸ் போடுங்க. பாருங்க எனக்கு நிறைய வேலை இருக்கு. ஆமா எனக்கு நிறைய வேலை இருக்கு. நான் உங்களுக்கு டீடைல்ஸா போட்டேன். மத்தபடி உங்களுக்கு ஏதாவது கேள்வி இருக்குன்னா அதோ என்னோட மேனேஜர் உட்கார்ந்துருக்காங்க பாரு. நான் சொல்லிட்டு அவர் கூட உட்கார்ந்துட்டா ஒரு வேல்யூ பண்ணது அவர் போய் கேளுங்க.
ஒரே ஒரு மேடம் சப்போஸ் நான் 20,000 கட்டி அக்கௌண்ட் ஓபன் பண்ணேன்னு வச்சுக்கோங்க. நடுவில் எனக்கு ஏதாவது எமர்ஜென்சி அந்த பைசா எடுத்துட்டேன் அப்படின்னு
ஒரு நிமிஷம் வெயிட் பண்ணுங்க.
அதுக்கப்புறம் வந்துட்டு இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட்
சொல்லுப்பா.
எவ்வளோ
எது இல்லையே நீங்க சித்தி அதுக்கு போறோமே இல்ல இல்ல உங்க சமைக்கலாம் சரி வேணா தக்காளி மட்டும் வாங்கிடுவா. என்ன என்ன கேட்டீங்க?
சப்போஸ் நான் 20,000 கையில் போட்டிங்கன்னா அதுக்கப்புறம் நம்ம சப்போஸ் டாக்குமெண்ட்லாம் சப்மிட் பண்ணால் எவ்வளோ நாள் ஆகும்? அதுக்கு ஏடிஎம் கார்டு
இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட்லாம் கொடுப்பாங்க சார். இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட் வந்து வருஷத்துக்கு 2 வாட்டி கிரெடிட் ஆகும். அது ஆட்டோமேட்டிக்கா கிரெடிட் ஆயிடும். 4% கொடுப்பாங்க. வித்ட்ரால்ஸ்லாம் நீங்க பண்ணிக்கலாம். ஏடிஎம் கார்டுலாம் கொடுப்பாங்க. அதெல்லாம் பார்ட் ஆஃப் தி டீல் ஆட்டோமேட்டிக்கா அதெல்லாம் நடக்கும். போது டாக்குமெண்ட்ஸ் கொண்டு வாங்க. அதான் ஓபன் பண்ற வழி பாருங்க. எதுக்கு தொட பேசிட்டே இருக்கீங்க? நாங்கெல்லாம் வேலை எப்படி பண்றதுங்க?
அதெல்லாம் போட்டுருக்கீங்க பட் அதெல்லாம் கேட்டோம்னா அக்கௌண்ட் ஒரே கொஸ்டின் கேட்குறேன். இது ஏடிஎம் கார்டு செக்லாம் பண்ணி கட்டிக்கணும். அதுக்கு ஏதாவது தனியாக அப்ளை பண்ணணுமா?
அதெல்லாம் பாருங்க சார். நீங்க அக்கௌண்ட் எப்போ ஓபன் பண்ணுவீங்க?
நான் டாக்குமெண்ட்
நீங்க இங்க கேட்டுட்டே இருந்தீங்கன்னா அக்கௌண்ட் ஓபன் பண்ண முடியாது சார். டாக்குமெண்ட்ஸ் எடுத்துட்டு வாங்க. அப்புறம் நம்ம பேசலாம். வேற ஏதாவது இருந்தா நீங்க மேனேஜ் பண்ணிக்கலாம். நிறைய வேலை இருக்கு.
டாக்குமெண்ட் எடுத்து
நீங்க அக்கௌண்ட் செக் பண்ணிக்கலாம். வேற எங்க அம்மாவே டேலி ஆக மாட்டாங்க.
So this data here, so for example, the Findex data we have up here, yes, I'll give Kali more to invite to do. Oh, and by the way, all of that, those are actual banker responses. Every piece of that line was taken from, yes, so that was also data. All of those exchanges were taken from recent data that was collected during the study. Yes, so actual lines spoken. So it's different kinds of data. Here we have, which we've heard a lot, people are reporting they don't have enough money. People are reporting they don't have enough documentation. Thinking, well, what should we do? We should lower the amount of we should make it a zero balance account. We should reduce more, make it so you don't have to provide any documents. But we also find that in presenting the results, for example, to the paper, time hours spent to open a bank account, ratings of staff behavior, we can present the data in these types of tables over here, or I can present it in these types of exchanges in Tamil and English. So guess which one is more effective at showing people which is a banking barrier, right? We need both, because I think no one would really believe me if I actually put a lot of these up. If I put a lot of these exchanges, people might not believe it. So these are the statistics that give those stories the communication power. But I can say that in presenting the results, this has been a lot more effective as a communication device for the data. So far I've talked about the power of storytelling for cognition, for understanding, as well as for communication. But now what I'm going to tell you next is a little bit different. And this is how stories themselves can be used as a form of data, and also for developing models and for theories. So they're good at conveying ideas, they're good at communicating our research. This is kind of a salesmanship argument that they're good at dressing up what we already know. But moving beyond the idea of stories as decoration, they can be a research tool in themselves. So they can be a form of data and a set of facts. They can be used to refute models or to suggest new models themselves. So this isn't the same types of stories that we would use to motivate somebody. This isn't a story, for example, of two guys that got a startup in their garage and an idea of overcoming great odds. And these are different types of stories. These are used to test and develop hypotheses. And these types of stories need to have two properties that are very important. They have to be anomalous or atypical. So they have to be not easily explained by a theory that you have. And they also have to be immutable. And the expression here that might be useful is that God is in every leaf of every tree. So that they can't change on every retelling of the story. So a very bad story, to motivate a bad data story, for example, would be, I met a woman in a village who took a microcredit loan and her life was made much better and her business was improved. Now there are a lot of different ways that that story could change over time. What village was it? What state was it? What woman? How old was she? The story can kind of tell. The edges can change. It's a changing story. So in this way, almost, data itself and the sourcing is very similar to how we would select data in any survey. We would want to know what was the source, how was it collected, what are the exact details that we want to know. You would want to know as much as possible about this story. So, and another way of defining anomalous would be the expression that dog bites man is not news, but man bites dog is great news. So a great data story would have to be something that has to be also defined with reference to a model. So it has to be surprising. So the idea that people respond to incentives, that you would give someone a monetary incentive and they would respond better, that wouldn't be a surprising story that we would want to hear. What would be surprising and what we might want to explore further is a story where you had a lot of people and you gave them money and they did the opposite of what you intended. Now that would be a story that we would want to know more about. Then we would ask the other criteria. Is this an immutable story? Even though it's not representative, can we get enough details on the story to really dive in deeply? So for example, if we gave people money and they performed the opposite way we intended, can we get enough details about this group of people to really figure out where did they work, what were the operational, how was it executed, to try to find out why did they behave in an upside down way, and why does this upend everything we think we know about economics or incentives or management. So attached to this presentation, or at the end of this presentation, which we'll send around, is a model of, yes, my data is bigger than your data. Why are you laughing, little IFF people? There's a very good paper on storytelling as evidence, but in terms of the statistical use, I didn't want to bog everyone down. But we did want to talk a little bit about the management use of data as well, for data for insights, which is related to its use for evidence, but it's evidence for insight here. And this is a bit of a cautionary warning, where it's that big data itself is not going to save you, and it will not provide you big insights. And this is where storytelling can be very valuable. So stories are oftentimes the only way to break through established patterns of thinking. Big data itself, or what we would call big data, is usually collected based on the ways we currently think about the world. So we have an idea that people behave a certain way, and we ask questions a certain way, and the data is encoded and collected that way. So for example, before September 11th, data was not collected on the flight patterns of on people that went to flight school. Another danger for development, for example, is trying to predict Ebola pattern outbreaks by Twitter or Google use. One of the problems is that most people that get Ebola don't do Google searches for their coughing. And so these are cases where the way that data is collected and reported oftentimes will not help us in our prediction and our encoding. To have a real breakthrough or an insight, it can only happen when you are willing to upend your assumptions and upend your beliefs. And a lot of times that has to come almost in a way from a shot from the side or from a story or something that's very unexpected. So for example, when Xerox, the maker of machines, of printing machines, was trying to sell machines to trying to go out and market its machines. They were very, very expensive. And they couldn't figure out how they could get return on this, and no one was buying the machines. Until suddenly they heard a story back from their sales guys that they just couldn't keep track of all the prints that people were making during the demos. Everyone kept coming to the demos just to make photocopies. So then they realized the money's not in the equipment itself. The money is from the prints. You can make money off of the service, and the money's not from the stream itself. So this is where you have to sometimes be willing to take information in an unexpected way and stop looking at things from a way. And there are lots of other, we've linked to a very good article about big data versus insight that will be on this, that helps just explain why for management and business, continuing to rely on old streams of data to expect it to provide you with an insight is sometimes not good. And that's where stories or looking at things from qualitative or from other disciplines can help you really break through either to insight or to new ways of analysis. So as much as we love big data, and I love it too, it's not possible yet to crunch your way to an insight. Unfortunately, computers and models don't have artificial intelligence, and that's something that until computers figure out how to ask a new question, we won't be able to tell them how to give us something new. So yes, we'll not be able to talk mathy to me. This was Vaishnavi's. But I wanted to end with another note as well, which is if we're going to elevate stories as evidence, it's important to select the right kind of story too. So if we think about, I mentioned earlier on that our stories are kind of at war. So the idea of how we see the world, which is that there's a right way to do things and a respectable way to do things. And a lot of times we're at war with cheap stories or sexy stories that are told by advocacy or by bad politicians that are often very seductive. It's not hard to pick up a weapon on the other side. It's also, if some of us are clever, to kind of pick up another cheap story, for example, of the woman whose life was saved by microcredit. That's not true. And to sort of lobby that on the other way. Or a picture of a child whose maybe a mom had nothing to do with microcredit and put that on a picture and say, isn't this a great thing? That's also not the way that we would advocate as we think responsible people that should be using stories or using stories as evidence or just being responsible. We think we should more go in the way of, say, honoring Galileo, which is you honor the truth first, and then look at a way to present that in the honorable way, and to try to find then a way to find justice to the true picture. And we think if you believe enough in your model or you believe enough in your data, you'll be able to find a way to illustrate that in an honest way. So in elevating stories as evidence, it's important to think about how any old story won't do. You can't just pick up anything and start using that. The origins of the story matter. You should look closely at where your story is coming from. You should examine the source. Be suspicious of things that tell you what you already want to hear. And this is standard for confirmation bias or for any data that's already telling you exactly what you thought was the great thing to hear. It tells you exactly what you know. And also a division between the stories that are often very good for management and communication are not the same stories that we would use for modeling in finance or for research. And that's perfectly okay. The bedtime stories that we tell our kids or to teach them morals and morality are not the same stories that I would use to tell a policymaker, and that's okay. But try to imagine, keep that straight a little bit. And this is a new field a bit, and that's why we hope that if you're interested more, you could do some of the readings. And there's even podcasts in there too as well. If you don't want to read anything, you just want to listen.